I'm Ellen Blaylock, co-chair of JCRC's Virginia Holocaust Commission, and it is my great pleasure to introduce Holocaust survivor, Mr. Claude Kacser.
Hello, I'm Claude Kacser. Please call me Mr. K. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very pleased you want to meet a Holocaust survivor, and I'm very pleased to be here for you virtually. Please excuse me, I'm going to be reading my talk. I hope this won't be very noticeable. My talk has 4 parts. Some important general discussion about Holocaust survivors, my own story, some important generalizations, and perhaps most important, my own important message to each of you. I'm a Jewish Holocaust survivor. That word Jewish is often omitted and simply assumed, but actually it is very important to make it explicit. Hitler was after the Jews. You all know what the Holocaust was. The deliberate murder of 6 million Jews, including 1.5 million children, simply because they were Jewish. The murders were done during World War II, between 1942 and 1945. They were done by the Nazis, the very powerful governing body of Germany. The Holocaust includes the persecution of the whole Jewish population in Germany during 1933, 1945, and in the lands Germany occupied. And very importantly, includes the murder of 5 million other civilians. This does not include the horrendous number of military and civilians killed during World War II, which is in the range 55 to 60 million. The Holocaust. The murder of 6 million Jews simply because they were Jews. I always use the word murdered because it was the Nazis' intention that their victims do die from starvation, from overwork, from disease, from gunshot, from gas. My great-uncle, Uncle Shoma, was murdered in Auschwitz, even though he simply did not wake up one morning. The Nazi intent was that he should die of hard labor and of starvation. And it did not help that he was 71. If he'd been younger, he would only have lasted a few more weeks. Again, I'm a Holocaust survivor, but I'm not an adult concentration camp survivor, barbed wire, striped pajamas, starvation, overwork. Those adult camp survivors, if they'd already been at least 16 in 1945, now in 2022, they would be 94. Very few people live to age 94. Similarly, if they'd been 26 then in 2022, they would be 104. And no one lives that long. There are very, very few adult concentration camp survivors still alive. That leaves child Holocaust survivors, like myself, survivors who were 16 or younger in World War II. Now in 2022, they would be in the range from ages 77 to 93. I am 88. Child Holocaust survivors, they are also died. Survivors and child survivors already dead or who are dying now rely on you to remember and learn from the stories of their lives, from the books they have written and the talks they have given.
You are an eyewitness to the events of the Holocaust, Mr. K. Those who are hearing you today become witnesses to the eyewitness. You are charging them with the responsibility to remember and share what they learned from you. Can you please tell us more about survivors who, like you, were children during the Holocaust?
Yes, Jewish Holocaust child survivors of the Holocaust. A few, but only very, very few children did survive in concentration camps. So we ask, how did most child survivors survive? Here are some possible ways. Hide out of sight in fear every day. Hide in plain sight in fear every day. Flee in fear while fleeing still in Nazi land. I myself fled at age 6.5. Another division. Were you with your parents or were you separate from your parents? Probably with other adults, but then you really were alone. I, at age 6.5, fled without my parents. I believe that one absolutely huge difference was whether you were with a parent or alone. And another very important fact was your age. I was 6.5. Before I get to myself, I'm going to tell you actual very brief stories. Each one is a friend of mine. Of course, each one is Jewish. Hide with your mother. She and her mother hid in a potato shed on a farm. The farmer risked his life every day to bring them food. The farmer was heroic. She, after she was liberated and came to America, would drive her car with a potato on the passenger seat in thankfulness to remind herself of how wonderful the potato shed was and the potatoes in it. Hide with his or her whole family. A girl aged 1 who hid in a Dutch attic with her whole family. Terrifyingly, when she was liberated at age 3, she was scared of the openness. She did not know that the openness was where you ran around, where you shouted, where you had fun, where you played. She was scared of the openness. She was only used to her small, closed-in Dutch attic. Hide alone in a forest. This is absolutely remarkable. A girl aged about 14. Somehow, very unfortunately, she and her mother got separated when they were in the forest, so she was alone, and she survived for 2 years in the forest, eating roots and berries and stealing from farms. And very occasionally, a farmer would help her, but that was very risky because the farmer might turn her in. When she was found, she was a bare skeleton. Hide in plain sight with substitute parents. A boy aged 4 and his sister aged 2. They lived with a Catholic family as if they were visitors from the country, cousins from the country. They had to learn to be Catholic. They had to learn to respond to false names. They both learned to love their foster family very much, who gave them love. And after the war, they kept in touch. Hide in plain sight, alone. Age 12, she hid in a convent boarding school. No one knew she was Jewish except the Mother Superior, the principal. She was in fear every day of accidentally revealing herself as a Jew, or that the Mother Superior might reveal her somehow. Flee with your parents. A girl about 6 started in Germany. Their family fled to France. They crossed the Pyrenees Mountains, climbing, and they are real mountains, into Spain, Portugal, and a boat to the United States. Flee alone. This is a remarkable story of a good government, the Kindertransport to England. About 10,000 Holocaust child survivors managed to flee to England in a program that the British government helped and encouraged. There were no visa requirements. The government made radio announcements. Of course, the Jewish community had to find housing for each of the kids, typically in a Jewish family in England. And they had to put up a money surety to guarantee that the kids would not be a drain on the British government. The final case, Jewish children who fled alone directly to the United States. I was one of these. This is like and unlike the previous story of the Kindertransport to England. It is an American story about 1,400 Holocaust child survivors. They came alone. They're called the 1,000 children. Look up 1,000 children in Wikipedia. 1,000 children, not child. And also go to the first web reference there. As well as children who fled alone, a small number of Jewish families also managed to flee to the United States. Sadly, the United States did not help these fleers from Hitler, as the British government has helped the Kindertransport. In the aftermath of the Depression, and with a strong isolationism, and the documented State Department overt anti-Semitism, these all prevented more Jewish refugees from being saved by the United States.
Despite the differences that you describe in how some children were able to survive the Holocaust, we also see that nearly all of them faced great hardships. Most lived every day in fear of being discovered, which would have meant almost certain death. Please tell us what you yourself experienced.
Each person's story is unique, but there are also very important common aspects. My story is very unique. The Nazis were never right behind me. And yet my story is also very typical for many child Holocaust survivors. My family and I were Jewish. That is the cause of the whole story. Hitler was after the Jews. My family was secular and totally assimilated. My mother was born in Berlin, Germany. My father was born in Vienna, Austria. He was an electrical engineer. They met in Paris and courted in French. They married and set up a French household in Paris. I was born in 1934 in Paris, France. That makes me 88 in 2022. When I was a baby, aged 1, we moved to Vienna, Austria, to rejoin my father's aging parents. But it remained a French family and I spoke French. In 1936, when I'm 2, we moved to London, England. I'm still speaking French. I'd go to a French nursery school in London. Leaving Vienna, Austria was probably due to the anti-Semitism in Austria, prejudices and discrimination against Jews. My father was very sensitive and surely felt this anti-Semitism. My mother watched Hitler's path with horror. In 1938, Hitler moved through Austria and Czechoslovakia. And then Kristallnacht in November 1938. This is now more properly called the November Pogrom. A pogrom, an organized riot with destruction and probably some murders. An organized riot. In 1939, Hitler then attacked Poland, which started World War II. Poland was defeated in less than 1 month. 7 months pause in the war, then May 1940, Hitler's remarkable blitzkrieg with tanks and soldiers through Holland, Belgium, Luxembourg, and on to France, which was defeated in slightly more than 6 weeks. The United States was still isolationist and neutral. Now England itself was alone and was really threatened. The German invasion ships were gathering on the other side of England's protective water, the English Channel. The German Air Force was attacking British airfields and airplanes. With courage, the British Air Force defeated the Germans in the Battle of Britain. Churchill, the Prime Minister, makes a speech. We will fight on the beaches. We will fight in the fields. We will fight in the towns. We shall never surrender. Churchill is telling the English that they very probably are going to be fighting on English soil. Non-Jewish and Jewish English school children are being evacuated to the countryside and some even to overseas.
The British and your parents must have been very frightened at the possibility of a German invasion.
Actually, one of the important virtues of the British that I admire greatly is that they do not get very excited. They simply carry on. But yes, the threat of an invasion was very, very real. And yes, my mother was very frightened. Meanwhile, the British interned my Jewish father as a friendly enemy alien, whatever that means, as well as about 24,000 similar male Jewish refugees. Women didn't count. My mother was now a single mother. My mother had no doubt at all about Hitler's general intentions against the Jews if England were conquered. She was intent that Hitler should not be able to reach our family, and most importantly, not reach her adorable 6.5-year-old. That's me. My mother, sadly but definitively, decided that I had to be sent away from England to a land of safety, the United States. However, my parents would not be able to come with me because they were considered friendly enemy aliens. I, fortunately, was simply stateless. Fortunately, we had a distant relative in the United States. It was arranged that in late September 1940, I was to be sent to the United States by myself at age 6.5. At the English ship dock, I was to be handed over to a married couple whom I'd never met, who were to escort me on the 10-day boat trip to New York City on a very empty, scary ocean. In New York City, they were to hand me over to the care of a 51-year-old bachelor distant relative, whom I called Uncle Martin, who did not know much about children. Again, I'd never met him before. Uncle Martin legally sponsored me, and he promised to look after me for the duration of the war, actually 5 more years. He, a confirmed bachelor, was remarkably generous in his willingness to do this. I now am very, very grateful to him. Of course, he was forced to place me in a small boarding school. But remember, I was only 6.5. I would like you to spend the next 10 seconds in imagining yourself, age 6.5, being shipped away from your parents into the care of a 51-year-old confirmed bachelor distant relative whom you had never met. Your mother tells you that she will see you again soon, but she knows this isn't true. Imagine yourself at the boat pier at the moment of separation, saying goodbye to your parents. Remember, you're 6.5. What are you thinking? What are you feeling? I hope you had some scary thoughts. I myself have no memory of that parting between my parents and myself. In fact, I have no complete memories until I was 8.5. I'm not surprised that I've forgotten these first years of my life. They were too painful. I received no love. I had no safety. They were too traumatic for me to handle at my age. Too difficult at my age. And I have to tell you, I have tears in my eyes as I'm thinking about this again. Trauma. Of course, I've thought about those years and now know many of my facts. They're the same facts and therefore trauma as the 10,000 Kinder Transport Holocaust Child Survivors experienced in their flight away from Hitler to England and freedom. The same facts and therefore trauma as experienced by the 1,100 children who fled directly to the United States in freedom. Those child survivors who remained in Nazi-occupied lands had their own facts and trauma. This very event definitely included the intense fear of being found by the Nazis and then murdered.
You're helping us to understand how deeply the Holocaust wounded you and other children who were fleeing or hiding from Nazi persecution. We are so sad to hear about the great suffering that you experienced in both day-to-day existence and in your feelings about what was happening, even if you weren't able to understand or express that at the time.
Yes, I do understand that what I'm saying is very, very sad. And I've said before, I'm actually having tears in my eyes. A few years ago, I was at a Child Holocaust Survivors workshop where we were all asked to draw something of our forgotten Holocaust experience. We were not to worry if we could not draw properly. Something forgotten. Forgotten here really meant suppressed as too painful. I drew that moment of parting. I drew my mother a large stick figure, and I drew myself very small and clinging to my mother's legs. Very strikingly and importantly, my mother's hands and palms were pushing away, shoving away pushing me away, shoving me away. And I was crying, and my mother was crying. Until that workshop, I have always said that my mother had sent me away. I never allowed myself to feel shoved away, shoved. And yet, for a 6.5-year-old who could not understand about the war or Hitler or safety, I was being shoved away. I was being rejected by my mother. As far as I was concerned, I was also rejected by my mother for the next 5 years until the war ended in 1945 and I went back to England. I had had those very strong feelings of rejection and abandonment at the dock when I left and for the following 5 years. At the time, I'm sure that I cried myself to sleep for many nights until I gave up crying. But afterwards, and even now, I cannot remember any of those feelings. Why should I want to? They were such strong and terrifying feelings that I could not allow myself to feel them. I suppressed them into my subconscious. Another very remarkable fact in my drawing was that my mother was in tears. She might never see her adorable 6.5-year-old son again. She didn't want to have to send me away from herself, but she knew she had to do it to save me from Hitler. Because of her nationality, she could not save herself, but she had to save me. She was making a huge sacrifice, and she knew that I would feel abandoned. She knew it, but she had to save me. Similar stresses happened to many Jewish Holocaust child survivors. Such extreme stresses do happen to many children that for reasons that have nothing to do with the Holocaust. For instance, a parent dying when a child is 6.5 or even younger.
You're talking about psychological stresses and trauma in children that can shadow them for a lifetime.
Yes, trauma. Holocaust child survivors suffered all sorts of stresses or traumas. But these child survivors were not ready to deal with the stress of trauma. The children were too young, like myself, at age 6.5 or whatever age. Children are not adults. They are children. Children are not ready for such stresses. They haven't gone through all the normal stages of development: childhood, young teen, older teen, adolescent. The stages and experiences that prepare you for the more difficult stresses of adult life and how to deal with those stresses. They are simply children. Back to my story. From 6.5 to 8.5, I was in this small all-year-round boarding school with 29 other waifs like myself. We all had this common set of stresses and trauma, and we all simply struggled on, perhaps crying in bed. I have only one memory of this first school, a good one, of one simple day of happiness, when Uncle Martin's mother, Great Aunt Golda, visited me and held my hand as we walked to get an ice cream cone. She gave me love and attention, if only for one day. My uncle visited me regularly, I wrote letters regularly to my mother, and she wrote to me from 8.5 to 11.5. Oops. At 8.5, I have to move to a different small boarding school. More trauma. Moving day was a difficult day practically, but more important, it was very difficult psychologically. Here we go again. I have to adjust to a new place, a new life, a new group of kids, and I had no parents to support me, no one to support me, but I am brave once again. At age 11.5, yippee, the Second World War in Europe is over. England has not been invaded. My parents are alive. I go back to England to my parents. My mother hugs me. She knows who I am. I hug my mother because I know that's what one does. But I don't have any real connection to this stranger. I will skip the facts of the rest of my life. There were some consequences of my having been a child Holocaust survivor. Mainly, it was a successful and professional and social life, one divorce, and now a very happy marriage. I now need to say something very important. In my own life, as it has developed, practically, professionally, socially, psychologically, those two large stresses and trauma of those years have impacted and affected my whole subsequent life. Those stresses and trauma then have meant that my own psyche was damaged, scars remain, and these scars have greatly affected my personality and even my social and professional functioning for many years afterwards. Childhood excessive trauma has that effect. In many people's lives, there's an external happening, a set of happenings that impact and affect the outcome of many later events. That's life. I failed math. My parents got divorced. I didn't get into such and such university. I am a Jewish child Holocaust survivor. That fact has determined a very great deal of my life. And it surely has influenced how I was and am with my daughter. She is the child of a child Holocaust survivor. And that has affected her life. Since the end of World War II in 1945, Germany has paid money compensation or reparations to many countries, including the Jewish state of Israel, and to many different groups of Holocaust survivors. In the year 2014, Germany recognized the additional trauma that Holocaust survivor children had suffered because they were not yet adults. Germany made an additional approximately $3,000 award to each Holocaust child survivor because they had not yet been adults. A token that a very meaningful recognition of this more difficult additional suffering of child Holocaust survivors. I myself am very grateful that Germany has made this meaningful token.
Of all the very important things that you are sharing with us, Mr. K, what would you most like your audience to take away from hearing you?
Yes, now I'm going to tell you my personal reason that I'm speaking to you here. The message that I want you to hear. my lapel pin, which I'm struggling to find, I don't expect you can see it, says Zachor. Zachor, that is Hebrew for remember. Remember, so that we make sure that it happens never again. Never again. There's a word for what was done in the Holocaust. The word is genocide, the deliberate killing of a large grouping of people, especially those of a particular ethnic group or nation. Genocide is the intentional action to destroy a people in whole or in part, an ethnic, national, racial, or religious group. The crime of genocide has been extended to include persecution, which includes an attempt to destroy the group's culture, and also forcible migration. Think ethnic cleansing. Genocide is now a United Nations official international crime, and the United States has signed the treaty. The United States is treaty bound to attempt to prevent or counter or protect any and all people from a genocide. Sadly, this is easier said than done. Again, my message to you, Lahore, never again for any genocide, any people, now and in the future. Sadly, there have been many genocides since the end of World War II, and even since 1988, when the United States signed the Genocide Treaty. In earlier years, Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, Srebrenica, and many more. Recently, in Iraq, the Yazidis were persecuted by the ISIS and also killed and murdered. And in the Congo. Most sadly, at this very moment in 2022, the Rohingya are being murdered and displaced by the Burmese. And the Yunguras are being persecuted and re-indoctrinated by the Chinese. Burma has been brought before the International Criminal Court, but sadly that has not stopped the Burmese genocide. They were told to stop by the court. Again, my charge to you today, genocide, it goes back a long way and continues today. Lahore, never again, no more genocide. And now the charge. If I see the beginning of genocide, do something. In your case as kids, also tell your parents to do something. Write your congressperson, petition, peacefully demonstrate. Zachor, never again. That is why I'm making this video. To be honest, I don't believe never again will happen. But we can work to oppose genocide.
You have given us so much to think about. A terrible part of your own personal history that we see is still happening in the world today. Like you, we must each be responsible for helping to prevent hatred, indifference, and genocide. Thank you for reminding us so forcefully that we each matter and that we can each make a difference. We all thank you for being here.
Thank you for listening, and please remember my charge.